I'm about to say something that's kind of insane to think about. Did you know that Breath of the Wild is now 5 years old? That's half a decade gone by in what feels like an instant. The same can be said for the Switch itself. In case you've forgotten, Breath of the Wild released on the same day as Nintendo's next-gen console, and ever since then the Switch's library has expanded with even more quality games. Honestly, it may be Nintendo's most impressive lineup on a single console. Not only did it experiment with the already established formulas of popular franchises, it also brought other series back to life such as Xenoblade and Metroid. Not to mention that the Nintendo Switch succeeds where the Wii U couldn't when it comes to third-party support. For many people, the Switch has taken the spot of favorite console of all time, and it's not hard to see why. People don't buy Nintendo's products for the power or performance, they do it because of the exclusive games. And while technically not a Switch exclusive, Breath of the Wild played a huge part in the console's initial sales. It was the only AAA title available at launch, giving it plenty of time to establish itself as one of the biggest and most loved games of the decade. But one of the worst parts about coming across games as good as this is how you feel once you've finally finished. It's that same sort of feeling you get at the end of an incredible anime series or TV show. You're left with this void inside you that can only be filled by the thing you just finished playing or watching. It's why you always see online posts asking for recommendations based on certain games or shows. And for those who feel that way about Breath of the Wild, this is the video for you. Just because the sequel isn't out yet, it doesn't mean you can't fill that void with other games similar to Breath of the Wild. So, let's talk about 5 games worth trying out if you loved The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. If we're going to talk about games similar to Breath of the Wild, what better place to start than Genshin Impact, a game released in 2020 which is certainly not afraid of showing off just how much inspiration it takes from Zelda's open world title. Throughout the past 16 months, it has established itself as its own game, while also taking some of the best parts of Breath of the Wild, such as the ability to climb or glide anywhere. Genshin Impact tells the story of twins who are separated from each other after encountering an unknown god. Sometime after, you awaken in the lands of Teyvat and meet Paimon, who accompanies you on your journey to find your lost sibling. But as you travel through Teyvat and its 7 nations, the player learns more about its history, whether it be the Archons who rule the lands, the destruction of Khaenri'ah 500 years ago, or the legion of monsters terrorizing the lands known as the Abyss Order. If you finished Breath of the Wild with some disappointment as to how the game handled its story, then Genshin Impact may just be the thing you need to fill this void. The amount of lore in this game at times can feel overwhelming. Even the tiniest details such as artifact descriptions include backstories to characters seen in the game. But that's not the only reason why I recommend playing Genshin Impact. Most people who watch my channel do so because they love one thing: Zelda theories, or just game theories in general. Very few series are capable of building up a theory community as big as Zelda's. Either they're games without lore, or ones that aren't quote-unquote mainstream enough. Well, Genshin Impact is a game that manages to fill both of these criteria. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that this game's potential in theory crafting may make it surpass Zelda's one day. And one of the reasons I say that is because Genshin Impact is a game that continues to receive updates. In truth, we're only partway into the story. Teyvat is made up of 7 different nations, and as of now, only 3 of them have been released. Not to mention all of the special events that go on, some of them loosely tied to the main story and its characters. Sometimes these plots have nothing to do with the overarching narrative, yet the stories they tell are just as interesting. If there's one thing that holds this game back in regards to lore, it's the amount of dialogue you're forced to sit through. Most of the important quests are voiced over, but on some occasions it feels as if certain events or side quests would have greatly benefited from the voiceover treatment. At times it will really be tempting to just skip the dialogue as it can feel like filler, even if the story itself is interesting. Something that's unique about Genshin Impact is its combat. Instead of playing as a single character, your party can include a maximum of 4 at any given time. Each unit is unique in both the weapon they use as well as elemental type. Combining certain elements mid-battle will result in elemental reactions, which makes the combat part of this game both engaging and oddly satisfying to pull off. And let me tell you, Genshin Impact is a gorgeous game with one of the best soundtracks I've ever heard. It's hard to believe that this is a free-to-play game. Oh yeah, that's the best part of this. It's the only game on this list that you can start playing right now. If you love it, great. If not, you won't have to worry about getting any refunds. But of course, there are some big reasons why you should also stay as far away from this game as possible. While Genshin Impact is primarily a single-player experience, it is at its core a gacha game, meaning that 1, it can get very grindy and repetitive at times, and 2, the microtransactions are downright predatory. Hoyoverse does have pity systems built into the character and weapon drop rates. However, reaching those pity points will require you to buy multiple packs of their most expensive crystals. Now, the good news is that it's relatively easy to get 4-star characters, and in many cases, some of these units are as good or even better than the 5 stars. My best piece of advice for this is kind of obvious. Start out as free-to-play and only spend money if you want to. There's nothing wrong with spending money in these games, the issue comes from whether you spend responsibly or not. And the other thing I highly suggest doing is not making Genshin Impact your main game. For new players, there will be a ton of content to get through, but the moment you binge through that, all that will be left are the monthly events, Spiral Abyss, and grinding domains to make your characters stronger while you wait for the next big region or story update. If you stick to playing the game for 30 minutes to an hour and a half each day, it will make the whole experience a lot better. At least, that's my opinion. Another thing that may turn off players is the anime-styled experience. Breath of the Wild did take inspiration from Ghibli films such as Princess Mononoke, but Genshin Impact is a lot more in your face when it comes to anime, especially the fan service side. The other problem is, while new players have a lot more content to go through compared to when the game was first released, it's not the most new player friendly. The game continues to release new characters, and in order to get the proper materials to make them stronger, you'll be forced to play the game until you reach certain regions. And since the main story is locked behind your adventure rank, something that you can only increase by a limited amount per day given the stamina sort of system often seen in these gacha games, this could take from a couple weeks to a month to happen. With all that said, I do recommend at least trying the game out. When it comes to the open world genre, at times it can feel shoehorned in by developers. Instead of the appeal coming from an immersive story with well-written characters and addictive gameplay, the game's biggest selling point is that it has an open world. And when developers say this, often they're not boasting about the quality of the open world, just the fact that their game has one. But there are rare occasions when companies deliver with open world experiences. In some ways, you appreciate those bland open world type games since it makes the ones that are well executed shine brilliantly. Elden Ring is a game that has received a ton of praise for its open world. Before that was Breath of the Wild. Obviously, these aren't the only examples, but I'm trying to be as vague as possible since there are certain open world titles that may or may not be on this list. But if there's one game I've seen praised to Kingdom Come, one that, to many, is viewed as the best open world game of all time, it's The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. But I don't want to talk about this game since I myself haven't played it. However, I've heard enough good things about it to at least add it in as an honorable mention, so there you go. Instead, allow me to discuss another fantastic series. As previously established, Breath of the Wild took a lot of inspiration from Studio Ghibli, and something that's common among Ghibli films, such as Princess Mononoke and Spirited Away, is the inclusion of Japanese folklore and religions such as Shintoism. Perhaps what you love isn't the references or overall themes that are shared between both franchises, but the inclusion of real-world culture and history. You're someone who loves learning more about Japanese folklore and how it inspired the very thing you're playing. Well, if you're a person who loves learning about Japanese folklore and Shintoism, then Okami is the perfect game for you. Set in classical Japan, it tells the story of the sun goddess Amaterasu, who journeys to restore the land which has now been cursed by the 8-headed demon Orochi. It's a game heavily influenced by Japanese folklore and legends referencing characters from Japanese mythology, all neatly tied together by its drop-dead gorgeous art style, with every scene feeling like it's ripped directly off of an ink illustration. Gameplay-wise, it's very similar to what you'd see in the Zelda series. In fact, the director of the game, Hideki Kamiya, openly admits that much of Okami's gameplay was based off of The Legend of Zelda. And it shows. Okami includes many elements you'd see in a traditional Zelda game, such as basic platforming, puzzles, and combat, all while adding its own twists to the genre. One of the best parts about this game in particular is that you can get the HD version right now on Nintendo Switch, and even on this hardware, the game looks stunning. Prior to the Switch, the only other Nintendo console you could play Okami on was the Wii, a system which also introduced motion controls. As you'd expect, this led to mixed feedback. But when porting this to the Switch, the developers made the smart decision of including touch controls. So if you hate motion controls, nothing's stopping you from playing in handheld mode. I believe there's also an option to turn off motion controls altogether in favor of using a controller, but I can't remember if that's actually true. And even if this was the case, I've played the game both on the Wii and Switch, and I find that the motion controls for the latter are significantly better. Now, when it comes to freedom, this is one of the more linear experiences on this list, but the world is so well made that it all feels connected. Full disclaimer that while I loved my time with Okami HD, I've only played around half of the game. I stopped sometime after starting, not because I got bored, just because I forgot about it. But I absolutely need to go back and play this. I cannot tell you just how much I adore Horizon Zero Dawn, but I'll try. Looking back, this was the game that pushed me to try new series outside of the things I normally play. As a kid, I was the very definition of a Nintendo fanboy, and even then I only stuck to playing the mainstream series like Mario or Pokemon. Ever since then, I've been able to experience so many incredible games which would have not been possible if not for my decision to play this gem of a title. It was the sole reason why I bought a PlayStation 4. That's how much I wanted to try it. Now, why should you play Horizon Zero Dawn? Well, the thing that's kind of crazy is that, at surface level, the storyline of Breath of the Wild and Zero Dawn are eerily similar. You're exploring a post-apocalyptic world filled with technology built by a highly advanced civilization that has long since perished. Throughout your journey, it's revealed that some of this technology is being taken over by a mysterious force, and it's your mission to stop it. And remember that both games released within less than a week of each other, so this is all merely coincidence. The biggest difference between the two being the lore. My god, is there a ton of it in Zero Dawn. While Breath of the Wild is rather vague with the amount of information it gives through its main story and exploration, the same can't be said for Horizon. You'll explore the world and come across scannable data points that unlock audio recordings and walls of text that just dump you with information. For some, this may feel forced, but the way the information is presented is in an organic way. Conversations between characters who are long gone by the time of Zero Dawn, written up reports of experiments gone wrong, and the different ways people coped with the stress of, the whole end of the world thing. Even if you choose to ignore this, the main story itself is, in my opinion, so much better in Horizon Zero Dawn. But this comes down to personal preference. And can I just say that fighting machines based off of animals is such an amazing concept that Guerrilla Games executed flawlessly? Sometimes I'll ignore everything else and just fight a Thunderjaw even if I don't need to. But, as much as it pains me to admit, not everything in Horizon is executed well. At times the open world, while beautiful, feels empty. In my opinion, this was one of Zero Dawn's biggest weaknesses, and Breath of the Wild's biggest strengths. Especially because you can climb or paraglide anywhere in the latter. Horizon Zero Dawn's climbing feels clunky, and while they tried to fix this in the sequel, somehow the climbing itself feels worse. Don't get me wrong, this game has its moments when exploring the open world. I'd take scaling a tall neck over climbing a Sheikah Tower any day, but overall, Breath of the Wild's world feels more complete. I previously talked about how much I loved the machine combat in this game, however the same can't be said for those who prefer the melee side of fighting. The options for melee combat are non-existent, with the only weapon being your spear. Side quests are somewhat engaging with the stories, however the stiff facial animations and minimal body movements easily break the immersion. The good news is that a lot of these issues are fixed in the sequel, including quality of life changes like better fast travel systems and being able to loot everything from a machine without the worry of your inventory being too full. You should definitely start with Horizon Zero Dawn, and if you enjoy that game, then do play Forbidden West. There still are issues with it, however for the most part it's an example of a sequel done right. Play Red Dead Redemption 2. This isn't even a suggestion, it's me telling you to play it. What's sort of ironic about this statement is that, of all games on this list, it's the least relevant to Breath of the Wild. Red Dead Redemption 2 takes no inspiration from it, nor does it have a similar plotline or based on any sort of Japanese culture. Simply put, this game is incredible, and while I could sit here and list multiple reasons as to why that's the case, I can narrow it down to 3. The story, open world, and amount of detail put into the game. Breath of the Wild's narrative was a hit or miss for a lot of people, either you loved it or hated it. Most of the interesting bits were set in the game's past events. I'm pretty sure this was intended, as doing so meant the Zelda team could build the game all around the freedom aspect of it, and the first big hurdle a developer needs to deal with when making this sort of experience is the story. Stories are meant to be told chronologically. You can only give the player so much freedom until there's risk of them breaking the sequence of events. This is why a lot of games feel linear, as it's a go from point A to B to C sort of experience. Red Dead Redemption 2's story is much more fleshed out compared to Breath of the Wild's, while also giving you a feeling of non-linearity, and it does so by splitting the story into multiple chapters with sub-chapters. Each chapter has a final mission which leads into the next chapter, and to unlock this mission you're required to complete certain sub-chapters across the map. What's amazing about this is that there are times where you can choose what sub-chapters to start with. Not all of them will be related to the main story, and some of them are even optional, but a lot of these missions will either give additional backstory to the plethora of side characters in this game, or are in some way connected to the overall narrative. The actions taken by certain characters in certain side stories may come up later in another plotline, whether it be that chapter's final mission, which ties all those loose ends together, or something that's importance is only understood once you see the full picture.
Oh, him, you took the money. He wants it back, what's not to understand? Where's our money?
I don't have it.
Another thing that's incredible about Red Dead's story is that, unless it's directly tied to the main plot, almost all of the map is explorable from the very beginning, and even the areas that are off-limits can still be reached. The game never locks you out of certain locations. Sure, that town or city you visited won't yet be relevant to the story, but nothing's stopping you from exploring that area. Red Dead Redemption 2 is the perfect example of a game which both has a complex story, while also giving the player the right amount of freedom for an open world game. And lastly, Arthur Morgan is a brilliant protagonist. One of the more common tropes seen in gaming is the silent protagonist. While other characters are given distinct personalities through dialogue, at times the main character can feel very disconnected from the world, especially if all the speaking is done through other people. Not only is Arthur well written, he also has full-on voice acting, which, by the way, was done tremendously well. This is a huge contrast to Link, who remains quiet throughout Breath of the Wild. I don't know about you, but I think it's time to give this guy a voice. Well, okay, he has a voice, but you know what I mean. So yeah, Red Dead Redemption 2's story is pretty awesome. Next on the list is the open world. My two favorite parts about Breath of the Wild were the freedom and open world. It was filled with chests, shrines, towers, enemy camps, collectibles, side quests, and interesting structures. But one thing in particular that truly made this open world shine were the traversal options. You could walk, run, swim, glide, or climb almost anywhere. Unfortunately, Red Dead is more restricted in this category since your options are either traveling on foot or by horse. I'm not including fast travel here since that's an entirely different thing. I'm talking about terrain navigation. Though it is kind of hilarious to imagine Arthur Morgan using a paraglider. Can anyone make art of that? Just mention me at NintendoBlackCrisis on Twitter and I'll retweet it. But, I'll be honest here. I absolutely love Red Dead Redemption 2's open world. Where do I even begin with this segment? There's so much to discover in Red Dead's world, and it makes it feel so much more alive. which technically is accurate as the other is a post-apocalyptic setting, but that's not the point. And yes, some of the things in this game are also seen in Zelda's open world. You got your collectibles, travelers, and side quests, but a lot of these are just more fleshed out. I don't like a lot of Breath of the Wild side quests, with the exception of a few. A lot of them are as simple as giving an NPC a certain quantity of an item. Red Dead Redemption's are so much more enjoyable. It really feels like the people you interact with are living out their daily lives.
Hey! Need a hand with your horse?
Sounds good.
Shit.
And a lot of these aren't even side quests, they're just things that happen. One of the best parts about the open world are the random events that can happen. These range from things as simple as an ambush to saving a person from a deadly snake bite. And if you choose to help said individual, it actually rewards you later on in the game for doing so. In a lot of games, these random events will feel very generic and get old really fast. But even now, I'll discover things that I haven't before. And this leads into the third point. There is so much detail in this game. You know how one of Breath of the Wild's biggest charms is the fact that even today people are learning new things about the game? It's the exact same for Red Dead Redemption 2. The amount of care put into even the smallest of things is honestly nuts. Most of this coming from the realism portion of the game. It's clear that Rockstar did their research when developing this game, and tried their best to make it as realistic as possible. Even something as simple as hunting is surprisingly complex with its gameplay mechanics, whether it's things you learn from tutorials, or ones that the game doesn't necessarily tell you, but you pick up along the way. One of my favorite parts about Red Dead Redemption 2 is the horse mechanics. These creatures feel so alive when you're riding them, and it's easy to sink dozens of hours into the game just riding around and taking in the gorgeous landscapes. From what I've heard, Rockstar used motion capture in order to properly capture horse movements, and it shows. And let me tell you, once you ride a horse in Red Dead, no other game will feel the same. On my initial playthrough of Valhalla, one of the things I noticed was how fake the horses felt. The difference between this and Red Dead Redemption is like night and day. Now, there are some parts of this game which may discourage people from playing. In my opinion, Red Dead has two big issues. The first is, ironically, the amount of detail put into the game to make it feel realistic. Yes, this might sound strange since I just finished praising this game, but due to how much realism is present, there's a ton of mechanics you'll have to learn in order to get the most out of your experience. Wearing the right clothes based on the weather, proper horse care, cleaning your guns, keeping your health, stamina, Deadeye core filled, masking your scent when hunting, using the right weapons on the right animals, limited inventory, the list goes on. At times, the game feels both overwhelming and incredibly sluggish due to a desire for realistic gameplay. For example, Arthur will have to go through the same animations when looting bodies. If you pick up something such as a picture, you then have to press a button to have him turn it around. I know this is more of a nitpick, but it does at times make the game feel slow. When I first played Red Dead Redemption 2, I was quickly overwhelmed with just how many mechanics were in the game and stopped playing. But once I returned to it a few months later, I couldn't put it down. Once you start to learn the basics, it becomes addicting real quick, and you'll be fully immersed in this masterpiece of a world. And luckily, you can beat this game without needing to know some of its mechanics. I can't tell you how many times I forgot to clean my gun or brush my horse. Its combat is fairly simple, so you'll still be able to beat the game. But again, this flaw is a much more subjective one. I was completely fine with most of it once I started playing that second time, but for you it may be different. The second part of Red Dead that is quite lackluster is the online. I don't want to go into too much detail for this section, as Red Dead Redemption 2 treats its online as its own sort of game, but long story short, it's just not getting any sort of new content to it to keep players playing. Someone who's new to Red Dead Online will likely play for a month or so before getting bored. You'll end up doing the same thing each day, which will quickly become tiring, especially with Rockstar's questionable design choices. Like how you have to wait a set amount of time before completing a mission to get more gold. All I can say is that if you are interested in playing online, at least do so with a friend. It makes the overall experience a whole lot more enjoyable. Players also have the choice of buying the online separately for less money instead of needing to own Red Dead Redemption 2. And for people worried about that 2 in the title, from what I know, Red Dead 2 is actually a prequel to the original Red Dead Redemption, so you can go into this game without playing the first. One thing that's sort of funny about this game is how, while I started this segment by saying that Red Dead was the least relevant game on this list to Breath of the Wild, it's supposedly one of the games that inspired the developers when working on Breath of the Wild 2. There are things from Red Dead that I'd love to see used in the sequel, but we'll just have to wait and see. I will say this once again. Play Red Dead Redemption 2. This brings us to the final suggestion of this list. Because while I've talked on and on about how much I love Red Dead Redemption 2, there is one game, or to be more specific, game series, that is arguably a better recommendation for anyone who loved Breath of the Wild. And if you're one of the 14 million people who fall under this category, what better series to play than The Legend of Zelda? For a lot of people, this probably sounds like a strange thing to recommend. I mean, isn't it already obvious to go play the other games of a series if you loved one of them? But to me, Breath of the Wild is a special case. One of the reasons the game was so successful was because it broke that traditional Zelda formula, with one of the biggest selling points being the open world and freedom. Things that aren't normally a part of Zelda. By doing so, it appealed to a much wider audience. For many people, Breath of the Wild was their first Zelda game, and continues to be the only Zelda game they've played. It's quite strange given how many titles there are in the series. If I had to guess, it's because they're afraid. Afraid of being disappointed. If the biggest appeal about Breath of the Wild was its freedom and open world, that it went against the status quo of traditional Zelda, then would it even be possible to enjoy these other games? Games without open worlds that are much more linear experiences. To me, this stands as the biggest reason why some Breath of the Wild fans continue to avoid the past games. They're afraid of disappointment. But I feel like a lot of people with this mindset are missing out. It's okay to be cautious when trying new things, but you also don't want to limit yourself too much with what you play. Yes, you will play a lot of games, and will be disappointed by some. But some of my favorite games have been those which I never would have experienced if I stuck to solely Nintendo. I was not exaggerating when I said that playing Horizon Zero Dawn changed everything. I went from someone who only stuck to specific game series to trying out new things such as Elden Ring, and let me tell you, I would have never tried this game if it weren't for my past experiences with Horizon. The Legend of Zelda series may be formulaic at times, but each game is unique in its own way, with their own stories to tell. Whether it be the origins of the Master Sword, traveling through time to stop a cataclysmic event, or breaking a dark curse. I'm always asked what my favorite Zelda games are, and usually I'll answer with 3 titles: Majora's Mask, A Link Between Worlds, and Wind Waker HD. But one of the reasons why I don't give a specific answer is because I don't have any definitive favorites. Every game in the series has something about it that makes it stick out compared to the rest. The fully fleshed out side quests and 3-day cycle of Majora's Mask, the simple yet charming story of A Link Between Worlds, or the gorgeous graphics of Wind Waker HD. Or maybe you're interested in a more grim sort of Zelda game. Or one that's all about a rich and compelling story answering many of the series' questions and explains away the lore of many recurring items and characters. I cannot promise that you'll enjoy these games. Some of them will be a lot harder to immerse yourself in than others, but the point I'm trying to get across is that you won't know until you try. As for recommendations, it's hard for me to tell you what game to try first. Skyward Sword is theoretically the best starting point when it comes to understanding the story of the series, but is also criticized for being the most linear. My best suggestion is to watch some videos on the different games of the series and see if any in particular interest you. Games that I don't recommend for first-timers are the much older games, as well as Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks. Don't get me wrong, the DS games are underrated gems, but it's harder to get invested into these titles unless you've already experienced other games, and the touch controls don't really help. Also, do not start with Majora's Mask. I tried to, and it's honestly one of the worst games to begin with given the whole 3-day time limit mechanic. Ocarina of Time continues to be a fantastic game, so that's probably one of the better ones to start off with. But again, I highly suggest watching videos to see if any particular game is to your liking. I personally will provide a couple of links to ones I've made in the description below, all on different games in the series. And that's it from me. Thank you so much for sticking with me until the end of this video, and I hope you've enjoyed it. This is a topic I've wanted to cover for the longest time, and if there are any other game suggestions I missed, then feel free to post them in the comments for other people to see. And hopefully it will help keep people busy as we wait for more news on Breath of the Wild sequel. I've been NintendoBlackCrisis, and I'll see you all next time.